In many parts of the world, the debate whether human-induced climate change is real is already over. The conversation has moved on. The new question is, what do we do next? Today we're visiting 3 countries that are showing what action can look like in the real world, not as theory, but as practice. We'll look how Costa Rica doubled its forest cover while growing its economy, how Ethiopia is building a green shield to protect its food supply, and how Denmark transformed itself from a fossil fuel dependent nation to a global wind power leader. Now, these aren't perfect stories. They're not one-size-fits-all solutions, but they're proof of buy-in, resilience, and what becomes possible when the focus shifts from arguing about the problem to building the future. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Mack, and this is the Climate Translation. Our first stop is Costa Rica. If you've ever seen a travel brochure for this country, you've seen the image: lush rainforests, dense canopies, and wildlife everywhere. But that picture is relatively new. In the 1980s, Costa Rica had one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. Forest cover had dropped to just about 21% of the country's land area. Trees were being cleared rapidly for cattle, farming, and development. Economically, cutting forests made sense. Protecting them didn't. And that's the key point. Costa Rica didn't reverse this deforestation by asking people to be nicer to nature. They changed the math. In the mid-1990s, the country launched something called a Payment for Environmental Services, or PES, program. The idea was simple but radical. Forests provide real, measurable services, so landowners should be paid to maintain them. Those services include things we usually take for granted: clean drinking water, flood control, biodiversity, and yes, carbon storage. Instead of treating forests as idle land waiting to be used, Costa Rica treated it like infrastructure. Think of it this way. We pay people to maintain roads because roads benefit everyone. Costa Rica decided forests deserve the same logic. If your land helps keep rivers clean or stores carbon, the government pays you for that service. Suddenly, protecting trees wasn't just good for the environment, it made financial sense. The result was dramatic. Over the next few decades, forest cover rebounded to nearly 60% of the country. At the same time, Costa Rica's economy continued to grow. Ecotourism expanded. Rural landowners had new income streams. Conservation stopped being charity work and became a business model. Energy tells a similar story. For long stretches of the year, Costa Rica generates about 99% of its electricity from renewable sources, a mixture of hydropower, wind, and geothermal energy. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of long-term planning and constant investment. But this isn't a perfect success story. Costa Rica's biggest challenge right now is funding. Much of the money that pays landowners to protect forests came from a tax on gasoline. As Costa Ricans switched to electric vehicles, which are good for air quality and climate, that tax revenue shrank. In other words, success is creating a new problem. The country is now racing to find new ways to pay for the services its forests provide, without relying on fossil fuel to fund the conservation. That means new water fees, tourism-based funding, or international carbon markets have to be considered. And that brings us to the real lesson of Costa Rica. It isn't about copying one policy or one tax, it's about a mindset shift. Costa Rica treated nature as a natural capital, something that creates value when it's maintained and not destroyed. That framing helped align environmental goals with economic ones. It shows what's possible when environmental protection isn't treated as a sacrifice, but as an investment. And it also shows that even successful systems have to keep adapting, because building a greener economy isn't a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process. And with that in mind, let's head to our next stop, an African country tackling climate resilience from a very different starting point. Unlike Costa Rica, Ethiopia is not trying to restore forest after industrial-scale deforestation. It's on the front lines of climate impact, facing some of the most severe droughts and floods in modern history. Rainfall has become less predictable. Growing seasons are shifting. Food security is under pressure. Ethiopia is experiencing what scientists sometimes call the biological blade, the sharp edge where climate change cuts directly into ecosystems, agriculture, and even daily survival. So Ethiopia's response isn't primarily about carbon markets or long-term offsets. It's about resilience. In 2019, the government launched the Green Legacy Initiative, one of the largest reforestation efforts ever attempted. Since then, more than 20 million citizens have taken part, planting an estimated 40 billion seedlings, with a target of 54 billion by 2026. Those numbers are enormous, but what matters more is how they're planting. Much of the effort focuses on fruit-bearing and native trees like mangoes, avocados, and indigenous species that serve multiple purposes. These trees provide food, create income, stabilize soil, and reduce erosion. Their roots help hold land together during floods, and their shade helps reduce heat stress during droughts. In other words, the trees are doing multiple duty. They're helping absorb carbon, yes, but they're also protecting livelihoods right now. That approach has already begun to show results. Ethiopia has increased its national forest cover to about 23%, reversing decades of decline. In rural areas, communities are seeing improvements in soil stability and in local microclimates. But this is where the story gets harder. Planting a tree is easy, keeping it alive is not. Many of these seedlings are being planted during record-breaking droughts when water is scarce. Heat stress is intense, and young trees are vulnerable. As a result, seedling mortality rates are high in some regions. This is the central challenge Ethiopia faces. Reforestation isn't just a climate project, it's a survival project. And survival depends on follow-through, watering, protection from grazing, long-term land management, and time. Ethiopia is now calling for increased international support, not only to plant trees, but to help these new forests reach maturity. Because a forest that dies after 2 years doesn't protect food supplies, stabilize land, or store carbon. And that leads to the key lesson of Ethiopia's approach. Climate solutions don't look the same everywhere. For countries like Ethiopia, climate action is less about optimization and more about defense. It's about building a green shield, one that protects people from heat, hunger, and instability while also contributing to long-term climate goals. It reminds us that mitigation and adaptation often happen at the same time, and that success isn't measured only in tons of carbon, but in the resilience gained. With that in mind, let's move to our final example, a country that took a very different path, starting from a fossil fuel-heavy economy and deliberately transforming it. Denmark is often lauded as the gold standard for climate policy. The country's modern energy story began in the 1970s, after the global oil crisis exposed just how vulnerable fossil fuel dependence could be. Instead of treating that crisis as a temporary shock, Denmark made the long-term decision to invest heavily in wind power and reduce its reliance on imported fossil fuels. That decision shaped decades of policy. Today, more than half of Denmark's electricity comes from wind alone, with offshore wind farms playing a central role. Danish companies help pioneer turbine design, grid integration, and large-scale offshore construction. Wind didn't just decarbonize their power system, it became a cornerstone of their economy. But Denmark's leaders are well aware that electricity is only part of the climate problem. The harder challenge lies elsewhere: agriculture. Denmark is a major exporter of meat and dairy, and livestock farming produces a large amount of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. Cutting methane is one of the fastest ways to slow near-term warming, but it's very politically sensitive because it directly affects farmers' livelihoods. This is where Denmark has taken one of its boldest steps yet. In 2024, the country announced the Green Tripartite Agreement, a deal negotiated between government, industry, and farming groups. Starting in 2030, Denmark will be the first country in the world to place a carbon tax on livestock emissions. Under this system, farmers will pay a fee based on the methane emitted by cows and pigs, but it's not designed as a punishment. The revenue is earmarked to flow back into the system, funding green gas technologies, manure management, and reforestation efforts, while also helping farmers transition to lower emission practices. The idea is simple but significant. If emissions have a cost, then reducing them becomes part of your business model. Denmark isn't predicting that this is going to be easy. It's an experiment, one that treats agriculture as a climate sector and not as an exception. But even with this ambition, Denmark is running into a familiar obstacle: markets. In 2024, Denmark had an auction for 6 new offshore wind farms and received 0 bids. Rising construction costs, inflation, and higher interest rates made the projects too risky for developers under the existing terms. It was a wake-up call. Even in a country with strong public support, mature technology, and decades of experience, the clean energy transition still has to make economic sense for companies building it. Denmark is now redesigning its auction system, adjusting subsidies, risk sharing, and timelines to make sure wind power remains investable while staying aligned with climate goals. And that's the real lesson of the country. Leadership doesn't mean never hitting roadblocks. It means being willing to adjust when conditions change. Denmark shows what climate action looks like at the mature stage, not just deploying clean technology, but continuously reworking policies so they survive real-world economics. They've proven that ambitious climate policy can coexist with prosperity, but also that it requires constant attention, compromise, and course correction. When we look at the countries like Costa Rica, Ethiopia, and Denmark, there's a common reaction. People say, well, they're small. Their total emissions don't even compare to the United States or Russia or China. So how much difference can they really make? And mathematically, that's true. But that question misses the point. These countries aren't important because of how much carbon they emit. They're important because of how they decide. Think of climate action less like a single massive machine and more like a fleet. Large countries are the aircraft carriers, powerful, slow to turn, expensive to redesign. Smaller countries are pilot boats. They test routes. They navigate shallow waters. They make mistakes early when mistakes are still survivable. What Costa Rica, Ethiopia, and Denmark are offering isn't scale. They're offering proof of concept. Costa Rica shows what happens when you stop treating nature as scenery and start treating it as infrastructure. When forests are valued for what they do, protecting them stops being charity and starts being economics. Ethiopia shows what climate action looks like when the stakes aren't abstract. When drought and food security are immediate threats to the population, adaptation and mitigation collapse into the same project. Trees aren't planted to hit our carbon target, they're planted to keep people fed. Denmark shows what long-term transition really looks like, not just deploying clean energy, but revisiting hard sectors like agriculture, adjusting policies when markets push back, and accepting leadership doesn't mean perfection, it means persistence. These stories are different, but they share something important. In every case, progress required buy-in across the system. Government set the direction. Industry was given incentives and constraints. Communities were brought into the process and were not treated as obstacles. None of this happened because people suddenly agreed on everything. It happened because climate goals were embedded into economic and social systems instead of sitting off to the side as ideals. And that's the blueprint, not a single policy, not a universal solution, but a pattern. Climate progress happens when environmental goals are treated as design constraints, like safety or reliability, rather than optional add-ons. It also happens when countries are honest about the trade-offs. Costa Rica is now scrambling to fund the very forest it saved. Ethiopia is struggling to keep seedlings alive in a warming climate. And Denmark is learning that even mature clean energy systems have to adapt to market reality. These aren't failures. They're what real-world problem-solving looks like. The lesson isn't that every country should copy Costa Rica, Ethiopia, or Denmark. The lesson is that waiting for a perfect, painless solution will guarantee endless delay. Small countries move first, not because it's easy, but because someone has to. They map the terrain. They find the pressure points. They show what breaks and what holds. And once those paths exist, larger countries lose one of the most favorite excuses they have. It can't be done. The climate challenge isn't a lack of ideas. It's a lack of commitment to testing them, learning from them, and scaling what works. These countries don't solve climate change, but they do something just as important. They make the future less hypothetical. And that's what a blueprint really is. If there's one thing that these stories make clear, it's that climate progress doesn't start with perfection, it starts with decisions. Costa Rica decided forests were worth paying for. Ethiopia decided resilience couldn't wait. Denmark decided no sector was off limits, not even cows. None of these paths are simple, none are finished, and none scale automatically. But they show us something important. Climate action becomes real when it's designed into how a society works, how it grows food, produces energy, and measures value, not when it's treated as a side project. The future isn't waiting for a single breakthrough or a single country to solve everything. It's being built, piece by piece, by places willing to test ideas, adjust when they fail, and keep moving anyway. That's the part worth paying attention to. I'm Dr. Mack, and this has been The Climate Translation. If you have a question about the climate that you've been too afraid to ask, or if you have a differing opinion, please let me know. I can always use your viewpoints in future episodes. You can reach me at theclimatetranslation@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.